Yeah. So, we're going to continue the study of James that we started last week in our introduction. When you see the first PowerPoint, you're going to be terrified because all we're looking at today is going to be the first 4 verses of chapter 1. And you're going to think, if we're going to go that slow, it's going to take 13 years to do this. I wouldn't live that long, mostly because you'll take me out if it does. And if I was in the audience, I would join you. So, but we will be covering it at a faster pace, but there's a reason why we're going that slow with the first 4 verses of the book. So let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into our study. Father in heaven, we're thankful to you for the day, the blessings that you brought to us, that you provided abundantly for our welfare. We're thankful for the fellowship that we share as your children, for this congregation, for the labors that this congregation is involved in spreading your word. We ask that you would bless our assembly this morning, bless our classes and our studies. Bless us as we're listening to your word. It will take it to heart and grow from it. We're mindful that many of our number have special needs and are suffering from various trials at this time, and we ask your blessings on them. Help us to be aware of what we can do to help in these situations, and be with those who are friends and families of our congregation who are also suffering trials. Bless our parents in the raising of their children. Bless our shepherds as they guide our congregation. We ask these things in the name of your Son. Amen. Okay. I guess I have to turn this thing on, huh? There we go. Okay, we'll let this thing get caught up. I don't have a whole lot of time here. It was? All right, we'll go slide 3. Huh. Didn't print out that way. I don't know why. Okay, cool. Yeah. So all class materials will be available via Google Docs. I've had several people email me. If you want to get on it, send an email to j6collier@gmail.com. I'll send you back a link. And as we go through the class time, I'll update the material on there so you always have it. PowerPoints are always available the day of the lesson. So if you want to pull that up on your smartphone or something, knock yourself out. Chapter outlines will only be put up on the Google Docs when I finish that chapter. So that means for chapter 1, we're looking at March of 2023. Okay. I have an assignment for you. Last week I wanted to give you this assignment, but I ran out of time before I ran out of PowerPoints. But during the coming week, please read the letter of James out loud to yourself at least twice. I've been doing this. Anthony suggested something like this a long time ago, and I've been doing it ever since, every time I teach. And I have read it multiple times. I will read it multiple times again. So it took me 12 minutes the first time to do it. So it's not like I'm asking you to do something like read the entire book of Psalms or read the entire book of 1 Chronicles, which isn't all that long, but the first 10 chapters are all genealogies. So just once in the early part of the week and again in the latter part of the week, and that will help you in your study of the book as we're going through the class. Okay, last week we introduced the book of James and we classified this as a general epistle. Meaning that he doesn't write this thing to any specific audience. It was written by James, the brother of Jesus, probably around 60 AD, written from Jerusalem because that's where he was. And the intent of the letter is to show Christians that genuine faith in Christ is active and working. So this is not a passive thing or an intellectual thing. There's some doing and being and things like that that we're going to be constantly grappling with, and that's really his purpose. Last week I took you on a little historical overview of the Roman Empire between 50 and 60 AD. This was an important time in Roman history and in church history. 50 AD, the church is roughly 20 years old. So it's been around for 20 years. Paul's second missionary and third missionary journeys occur in this particular decade, the second one early, the third one late. Christianity is expanding rapidly, and the Roman Empire is beginning to both notice its growth and become concerned about its spread. And I quoted an ancient Roman writer last week who said that described Christianity as a plague throughout the countryside. So It's different. It's not what they're used to. It's not their values. They're kind of starting to look at this thing a little bit differently. In 54 AD, Nero becomes emperor of Rome, and he will violently persecute the church in the 60s. So that may be a part of an explanation of why this book opens the way that it does. Our approach to the study, we are going to follow an inductive approach to this study. Anthony taught us a class on this before COVID. I found it very helpful. I felt like most of the time when I was studying, and I was doing like halfway anyway, so we're going to do it this way. I've given you a link to go to if you want to kind of get an overview of how to do an inductive Bible study. But basically, there are 3 steps involved. The first step is observation, and that is where you look at the text and you try to identify things that we need to understand to get the message. This could be places, it could be events, it could be words, it could be historical things or anything like that. Just anything that you need to understand to be able to decipher what the message is. Interpretation is find the meaning of the passage. Start with the simplest explanation from the passage and go from there. Now sometimes what might be the obvious interpretation conflicts with other scriptures, so we've got the wrong answer here. But that's what we're going to do. And finally, application. What does the passage teach us? What does it teach us about God? What does it teach us about ourselves? What does it teach us about how we should respond in a given situation? So there's always something that the writer is trying to make apparent to us. So that's these 3 things will hopefully help us get there. Because this letter focuses on how faith is active and working, we will be paying close attention to the verbs and participles in the text that apply to the reader, i.e. us. Verbs express action. In all languages, verbs express action. Participles are verbs that are being used as adjectives. And really, what it boils down to, a participle is a verb plus ing. So some examples: going, teaching, walking, thinking, eating. Side note, Koine Greek language is a language of participles. I mean, all of their adjectives are participles. So they're talking about the walking man, the sleeping woman, or the drinking king, or something like that. So they're always doing this thing. So, but those are important too, because participles in this way express action. So what he says, there are other verbs used in the book that other things are going to be doing, or other entities, but the ones that apply to the reader are of special importance to us. So, any questions or comments? Let's open our Bibles and turn to James chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and I would like to have a volunteer read that for us. Rick?
James, bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greetings. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing.
Hey, I got there. So, this slide here is breaking down this particular passage following the guidelines I gave you earlier about doing an inductive study. The yellow highlights are terms that are used in this passage that are things we need to understand. We need to understand what a bondservant is. We need to understand what joy is, what perfect is, and what complete is, and some of these other things. The magenta words are the verbs and participles that apply to the reader. So whatever he's going to tell us in this passage, these verbs are going to tell us what it means to us, how we're supposed to respond to it. So, and I will do this whenever we're breaking down a passage. I'll give you a slide like this that shows the passage, what the words are that we're going to go after, what the verbs are that we're going to listen to. So, James opens his letter in the typical style of a Greek letter. He basically introduces himself and identifies his audience and then offers a greeting. So, where this goes off from the normal Greek letter of that day and time is that James doesn't say anything personal to his audience here. Like when you're reading a letter of Paul, he will often say, I give thanks to you, or I give thanks to God because your congregation's doing really well, it's growing, it's expanding, and things like that. There's really only one case when Paul doesn't do that, when he's writing to the Galatians, because it's a problem, he gets into it. James doesn't do this at all. So the first word is translated as bondservant or servant in the ESV. This refers to either an indentured servant or a slave. What is the difference? A slave is put into servitude against their will. It's an involuntary relationship. I mentioned last week that possibly as much as 1/3 of the Roman Empire was slaves. The Roman Empire in this day and time period goes to war for two reasons. Number one, to acquire territory and resources, and number two, to replenish its slave population. So that's an involuntary relationship. A bondservant or an indentured servant is one who enters into the relationship voluntarily. Why would you do that? Well, one reason you might become an indentured servant is because it beats starving to death. If you have nothing, you have no job, you have no resources, you have no food, no clothing, or anything like that, sign up for 7 years and you'll get all of those things. Another reason why you might become an indentured servant is to apprentice yourself to a tradesman and learn a craft, a job skill. And those were typically a 7-year thing. So you want to learn how to be a blacksmith so you can go on Forged in Fire? You do a 7-year apprenticeship that way. So the bondservant term is most often used by English translations because it's the more appropriate word, isn't it? We chose to go in to this relationship for some sort of benefit or something that we're going to get out of it. In both cases, the bondservant and the slave are going to listen to the Lord. Whoever it is that they're indentured servant to, they're going to listen to that. But this is a voluntary choice for us. So that's kind of an important distinction there, and that's why most of the English translations go with that particular term. Questions or comments? That's the wrong direction. Let's try this way. James's intended audience is the 12 tribes who are dispersed. It says in the New American Standard Bible, it may say diaspora or something like that. And I mentioned this last week. It's a common phrase used to describe Jews living outside of Judea and Palestine. Very important culture this was. Paul goes to these people on his missionary journey. His first thing he does when he gets to a new place is he finds a synagogue. Or if there's no synagogue, he'll go down by the river or someplace where Jews who would meet to have prayer and things like that on the Sabbath, but that was what he was always going to do. Here, James is using it to describe Christians and emphasizing that we are aliens living outside our homeland. On 1 Peter 1:1, Peter writes to the aliens living, in the world here, because we are in the world, not of the world. That's the goal, right? We're here, we're going to participate in the economy, we're going to live and things like that, but this isn't home. And that's what he's implying here and using this. Then he uses the word greetings, offers a greeting. This is an interesting word. It's a Greek word that's derived from the Greek word for grace, charis. Our English word charisma, describing a person that you just really like to be around and things like that, comes from this word. The Greek word that's translated joy also derives from charis. And both of these terms have the idea of being aware of grace. Now, normally when we think of joy, we think of a kind of a euphoric feeling, that kind of a thing. I don't think I want to go there yet. And for example, on your wedding day, what did you feel? What else did you feel? Yeah. Joy, right? I'm getting married. Somebody loves me. This is a really joyous occasion. I didn't think I was ever going to get to this particular point. The birth of your children, what do you think? Joy. Now that's going to change over time. There will come a time with the child when you're going to sit there and think, I hope this child was switched at the hospital at birth, because surely we could not have produced this genetic anomaly. But there's joy there in it, and that's a good feeling. But joy isn't always the euphoric feeling, is it? And what James is telling us here is be aware of the grace. And in this particular situation, that's a very appropriate thing to do. And so in verses 2 and 3, James addresses the problem of trials and how they should be received by Christians. And the word that's translated trials in the New American Standard, New King James, is translated temptations in the King James and the American Standard Version, sometimes persecutions by other translations, and it means to put to the test. Now, I was an engineer by training and by trade, and one of the things that we learned as engineers was test everything, trust nothing. So you're working on a software application, which is what I used to do. You test everything. You click every button. You do every use case. And then, especially when you're looking at somebody else's code, when you find something, you feel giddy about it. You know, hey, look what I found in your code. You know why you do that? Because they just did that to you 2 hours earlier. Okay. Test everything, trust nothing. And the more important the thing is that's under test, the more aggressive and rigorously you have to test it. If your software application, your word processor, or the game you were playing or something like that blows up and crashes, you know, blue screen of death type thing, you might mumble about it, but nobody died. If the avionics system on a commercial aircraft doesn't work correctly and the plane crashes and people die, that's a different situation, isn't it? So testing is a very important thing here. So we're going to put this thing to the test. In a modern manufacturing facility, there's a quality assurance department, and they often sample whatever's coming off the line, if it's cookies or circuit boards or something like that, and then run this sample through a battery of tests to ensure that the product meets specifications or standards. This is the trial. And James is telling us trials, these tests, come in many forms. Some trials come because we're human beings. How many of you have ever been sick? Yeah. How many of you had your gallbladder taken out? How many of you had like 4 to 5 hours of the most intense pain you ever experienced in your life before they took the gallbladder out? Yeah. I had my gallbladder out. Wife had hers out 11 months later. I had mine out. And that was probably the most intense pain I've ever had. Now, I didn't give birth to children, so I can't say that it's on that particular level. But you think about this. The gallbladder, that big, weighs a few ounces. That thing punches way above its weight. And it was the pain, obviously, that told me, yeah, you probably ought to get rid of that thing. So, you know, that's a trial. How many of you have ever had relationship difficulties? You know, that joy you felt on your wedding day, you know, that spouse now has turned out to be in this instance, the most contrary creature you ever met in your life. Or you are the most contrary creature that he or she has ever met in their life. Been dumped, had to dump somebody. We're all familiar with this. How many of you have had too much month left at the end of the money? You know, all of these things. Yeah, these are trials. And you know, they're at least uncomfortable. Sometimes they're extremely painful. In some cases, they're life-threatening. And guess what? You're going to have them. That's just part of being in the human condition. Some trials are self-inflicted. The fact that you did something that was really stupid because you didn't understand the laws of physics still apply in this case, and you just about killed yourself. Been down that path. Sometimes it's self-inflicted because you knew it was wrong, and you decided to do it anyway. Temptation is a special kind of trial that can bring to separation from God if we yield to it, but it's called a temptation because it appeals to something. There's something in our character, something in our desires that thing appears to, so it's a trial. Persecution is another special kind of trial that can be extremely difficult, and in this case, because the quickest and easiest way to make it stop is to give in to the persecutors. This is what the Roman Empire is going to do. They're going to get somebody and say, swear loyalty to the emperor, renounce Christ, or we're going to kill you. That's a pretty tempting proposition, you know. Hey, renounce now, repent later, that kind of a thing. You know, we could justify it that way. That's, you know, those are all trials and things like that. But whatever the trial is, James says we're supposed to consider or count it all joy. Questions or comments? Okay, the word that's translated consider or count means to lead or consider, and it really has the idea of to reason through to a conclusion. How many of you have ever constructed a list, where you get a piece of paper out and you draw a line down the middle of the paper and you say, here's my pros, here's my cons. If you bought a house or something like that, if you're on TV buying a house, there's always three choices. I don't know how this always works out, but there's three choices that you have to look at, and there's always something wrong with each house, and there's always something right with each house. And so at the end of the episode, we'll figure out which one you bought. That's a consider. In other passages, it's sometimes translated as an accounting term, and accountants are good at considering things because it's their job to count the money. And then they have these special reports like balance sheets and profit and loss statements and financial reports and things like that, all intended to reach a conclusion. Are we profitable? And if we're not profitable, maybe it'll give us a hint about something that we might need to adjust so that we can get profitable. But they're all intended to lead to an accurate conclusion about a situation, and that's what we're supposed to do with the trial. We have to, count the cost here, count the joy here, but we are to achieve a joy. It might be painful, but we have to understand there's also grace coming in with the trial, isn't there? Not going to be overwhelmed by this thing. We can endure it. Might not be very comfortable, but there's a way to do that. So, and that's the conclusion that James wants us to reach. Some of these buttons on here, I would be better off if they weren't here. When I was a practicing software engineer, my nickname was the destroyer of technologies. Because if there was a flaw in it, I was going to find it. So back to text. In verse 4, he's talking about endurance. The goal of the trial is to get this endurance, or patience, or something like that. And in the Greek, this kind of has the idea of having the long view. Long suffering is a term that they sometimes use. But it's an understanding of this spot I'm in right now is not the spot I'm headed for. It's not where I'm going to wind up. It's maybe way over there somewhere. But I have to understand that I have to walk this path to kind of get there. So this is why we don't kill our children at the age of 3 when they're in the terrible twos and things like that, because there's a better goal here, and it's also illegal. But we will endure this situation for the outcome of it. The word that's translated let or allow is a Greek word that means actually to have and to hold. So when he's talking about hold on to this endurance in verse 4, he's saying grab it. Grab it and don't let it go. The reason we translate it as a passive verb is because the only activity we're supposed to do is to grab it, and then we are supposed to allow the endurance to do its perfect work. And what's its perfect work? Its perfect work is to make us perfect and complete. The Greek word translated perfect here in this situation does not mean moral perfection or without flaw. It means mature. And the Greek word that's translated complete means having all of its parts. So when you're dealing with the process of maturity, there's always a time element involved in there, isn't it? In our country, in our culture, it takes 18 years to transform an infant into a legal citizen that can vote. 18 years. It takes 21 years to transform them into a legal citizen that can vote and then willfully engage a series of self-destructive behaviors, that they can use to destroy themselves if they so choose to do that, to be legal. But that's a time period involved in there. So when we're talking about this enduring and this letting and all of these things that are happening, there is time involved. You may not have the patience today that you need to have, but you're growing towards it and you're going to get better at it. You may not have a particular skill as a Christian, or even a job skill for that matter, that you want to have or need to have, but you're growing to it and you're going to get there. And when you get there, you ought to have all of it, every bit of it. So I also wanted to mention the verb tense when he's talking about hold on to it is a type of verb tense that basically means hold on to it now, hold on to it in the future, and never let it go. It's that valuable. The outcome of the trial that you're going to get out of this thing is that valuable that you will want to hold on to this thing indefinitely. Any questions or comments? The idea of completeness, when I thought of this particular thing of it having all of its part, I thought of the 3 words of utter despair. There are 4 words in English language that are the words of doom, which is, we need to talk. No good conversation in history has ever begun with the words, we need to talk. The 3 words of utter despair is particularly poignant for parents, and usually it's guys, but it's gender neutral. It's some assembly required. So everybody, dads, we've all done this, haven't we? It's the day before Sally's birthday, and so we're frantically trying to put this thing together like there. And the usual guy thing in this situation, I don't need no stinking instructions. I know how to put a bicycle together. And then at some point you're, okay, where's the instructions? I got to figure out how to untangle this particular mess. But the worst thing of all is to get down to in the assembly and find out you're missing a part. Yeah. So I don't do the guy thing anymore. If I'm putting something together, whatever it is, I get the instructions out, I read it, then I lay all the parts out and things like that and make sure they're all there, and then I follow the instructions and put it together. So I've lost my man card like 15 years ago because of that. But not having all of the parts to finish it damages the product. I knew a guy when I lived out in Washington that had bought a compressor, air compressor. He put this thing all together, but it was missing one part, a 10-cent flat washer. The compressor was useless. It was worse than useless. It was actually dangerous. So you had to, find the part, get it in there, and things like that, and then it was fine after that. That's what's incomplete means, and this is the thing that James is telling us: don't be that way. We need to have, this trial is producing this endurance that's going to have this effect on us: mature and complete. Tim. Mm-hmm.
When your gallbladder's hurting you, the first thing you want it to do is stop.
Mm-hmm.
But he's telling us here, this is this important. When you are tested, when you have temptations, when you're in trial, remember what this produces, and it is important. So grab onto it.
Yeah.
Stay under it, because it's working.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It is a trial. It is a burden. We need to stay on target, stay on course here. Other questions or comments? Okay, interpretation. Trials will come. Notice James says when trials come, not if trials will come, or there's a non-zero probability that trials will come. He says when they will come. When trials come, think carefully about the trial and its purpose. They can range from mildly uncomfortable to painful to life-threatening. Oh, failure is also an option. What happens if you fail on a trial? And we don't like to talk about that because the American ideal is that we're always going to do everything perfect and everything like that. What happens if you fail? You learn something. I was a software developer for 35 years. The most important lessons I learned about developing software came from failure. That's not sin. I mean, that's just reality there. Now, in the spiritual sense, that sometimes involves sin. Most important lessons I learned came from failure. The ones that taught me the most were the ones where I had to struggle, for weeks at a time. And I didn't do this very often, but there were a couple of times in there where I was working on a problem that was so weird and so profound and so essential that it took me weeks to figure out what that was. But that's failure is an option, but failure is also a teacher. So, in the spiritual sense, maybe this tells you that you need to, here's something that we might need to focus on and grow on, and we can start to pursue that course of action. Ricky? None. No translation says if. That was my point. So, reach the conclusion that the trial is a joy because of the grace that is going to come with it, and the intent of the trial. There's a goal, there's a purpose in there. And you can look at the goal really in two ways. What's the short-term goal? Well, there's a characteristic that I need to acquire here, and this is the only way to really get it through, to get that characteristic. There's also an eternal goal, isn't it? This is part of shaping us to get us ready for heaven. So is it a joy? Yes, because if for no other reason, God cares about us enough to develop us. That's another thing. You know something about your employer, because at least in the software development industry, are they constantly training you in new skills? Are they constantly teaching you new things like that? I worked for Bell Labs for like 16 years, and that was their mantra. And the thing that told me it's time to go someplace else for employment was when they stopped doing that. I knew at that particular point the company was dead. So we're always constantly doing that. Know that the trial has a purpose. In this case, the immediate purpose is endurance or patience. The longer-term purpose prepares for eternity. The endurance produced by the trial also has its own perfect purpose. It's a maturing purpose as well, to make us perfect, to make us complete. I mentioned perfect, fully grown, mature, complete, having every part that it needs. Application. James focuses our attention on three verbs: consider, know, let. Notice that these three verbs are mental actions. This is the verbs that are taking place in the mind. Consider, evaluate this thing, count it up, see what you're going to gain, count it all a joy. Know the purpose of the trial is to produce this endurance to get us through it, and let the endurance bear its fruit of perfection and completeness. The trial can be endured by recognizing its purpose both in this life and for eternity, and it can be endured because we see the goal at the end of it. We can support each other during these trials. James doesn't mention that in this passage. He's going to discuss this concept a little bit later in the letter, but Paul clearly states in Galatians 6:2, bear one another's burden and thus fulfill the law of Christ. So if I'm in a trial, it's okay for you to help me. If you're in a trial, it's okay for me to help you. If you were in class Wednesday night, we had a really good discussion. Tim asked a question, and Richard Peralt's class got hijacked by the discussion. I've seen this happen every once in a while. Richard's a smart guy. He did the only thing a guy in that situation could do. He gave up. Fine. This is what we needed to discuss as a congregation was more important than the outline he had prepared. I never mind that when that happens in my classes. So if we need to hijack it, we can do that. But I learned some things out of that. I learned there's some people in this congregation that have clinical depression. I've never been diagnosed with that, but if I am, I'm going to be kind of curious about what does this mean? What's going to happen? What's life going to be like? I know some people now that can tell me. They can help. I also know that maybe I need to be a little bit more aware of their situation. I don't have to be uncomfortable around it, but I do have to understand there's a little bit something special there, and keep an eye on things. They're suffering from it now. It's not like they have it in the past. They're dealing with it now. So that's the type of consideration that we can do for each other. If somebody is seriously ill, we can't bear the illness for them, can we? No. But we can make it easier by taking care of the mundane stuff, the meals, the house cleanings, the rides to the hospital, and all of these other types of things that go with it for them and their family while they deal with this bigger problem. So, these are things that we can do. Did that again, didn't I? So, acknowledge the discomfort or pain of the trial, but don't under-acknowledge it, don't over-acknowledge it. What do I mean by that? We have this ideal in our culture that every individual stands on their own 2 feet. Whatever it is that I'm going through right now, this is mine and mine alone, and it is weakness on my part to let you help me. The over-acknowledge it thing is basically, I want to be a teenage drama queen. I want to be the center of attention. So, you know, this week my thumb hurts. Next week, you know, I have a bad haircut. Next week, you know, I'm $2 short on my mortgage payment. You see what I'm saying? Where we're always, you know, oversharing here a little bit here, because we're not really seeking support. We just want some attention. So there's a middle ground in here that we need to learn to operate in. This is a real problem. This is a real trial. I could use some help. It's a real problem. It's a real trial. I need to be aware that you might need some help. So the focus on the goal of the trial, it's endurance, it's heaven. That's your short-term, your long-term goals right there. That's the purpose for it. So what are some ways that we can support someone who is undergoing a trial? Listen. That's a good point. Let me wax historical on you for a moment there. Thank you for bringing that up. In World War I, the great war to end all wars, one of the things that they discovered was that the number of casualties produced in this war was horrific, absolutely horrific. And people who were wounded in World War I would come back to the hospitals and the aid stations and things like that, and you could kind of start to get them right physically, but not mentally, and they didn't really understand what was going on with this thing. It was post-traumatic stress disorder. And if there was ever a situation in human history where you should have it, that was it right there. But they're trying to get people in these beds. They don't have enough beds and things like that. And so they started taking the soldiers as they were healing up, and they would set them down together, and they would start talking to them, listening to them. And you know what happened? They got better. They improved. In fact, it soon became so obvious that they called this the talking cure. So don't ever underestimate the value of listening. Just having somebody know that you care helps the burden. So that's a good point. Other ways. Gotta love them, yeah.
And that at times is messy and ugly and sacrificial.
Yes. You do love them. And you see what is it that they need, and that's what agape does, isn't it? So how should we respond to God during and after the trial? Yeah, and that's true. I mean, that's actually one of the stages of grief, and end of life things is like the first thing is denial, and then the second thing is anger. That kind, So yeah, that's really not an appropriate response, is it? It actually reflects a lack of understanding, I think. Anything else? Yes.
Non-believers go through trials too. They don't get to go through them with God.
Yeah.
With them surrounding them.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and it can also be a huge opportunity.
One of the most important things is really evaluate and think about what you learned from it, and then how can I help the next person.
Yeah. Now, that always helps when you're in a trial or something like that, to go through and say, I know somebody that knows that. They can at least give me some guidance of what this is going to be like, how long it's, not maybe so much how long it's going to take, but what are some of the things that I might have to be aware of, that kind of thing. Yes, go ahead. Pray for them. That's always good, isn't it? Always good. Anything else? Well, I appreciate your attentions and comments. As a reminder, read the letter of James to yourself next week. Yes, go ahead.
One through it, I was reminded of a passage in Hebrews. I had never prayed for suffering or trial, but I asked that on myself. But I think it's Hebrews 8 I was looking at, where Christ was made perfect through suffering. So that important that Christ is perfect.
Okay, anything else? Okay, we'll see you all then next week, and we'll try to cover more than 4 verses next time.